Dad, you need to move out. A bed just opened up over at the Ivy Memory Care Center. Those words hit the air like a lead weight, instantly shattering the quiet of that Sunday morning. I stopped wiping down the counter. My hand hovered over the polished quartz, a surface I had personally measured, cut, and installed 30 years ago. I looked up across the wide kitchen island. My 39-year-old son, Kevin, was casually chewing on a piece of whole wheat toast. He didn't even bother to look up from his phone screen as he delivered the eviction notice. Sitting right next to him was his wife, Chloe. She picked up the custom mug I had bought her for Christmas last year, taking a slow, deliberate sip of her cold brew. Over the ceramic rim, she was smirking. It was a cold, calculating look that told me everything I needed to know. They had planned this. They had been whispering in the dark, plotting how to throw a 72-year-old man out of his own home. But what they didn't realize was that I wasn't the fragile, helpless old man they thought I was. By Wednesday, they were going to lose a lot more than just me. They were going to lose the roof over their heads and every single thing they thought they had stolen from me. Before I tell you exactly how I systematically and quietly dismantled their perfectly constructed lives, let me know in the comments below where you're watching this video from. And if you believe that respect is earned and betrayal should never go unanswered, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Now, let me take you back to that kitchen, back to the exact moment my own flesh and blood decided to toss me out like yesterday's trash. I stood there, clutching the damp dishcloth. The cool Seattle morning sun filtered through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. This wasn't just a house. It was a monument built from a lifetime of hard work, calluses, and sleepless nights. 35 years ago, when this lakeside property on Mercer Island was nothing but a muddy, overgrown slope, my late wife Irene and I bought it. I was a mechanical engineer back then, holding a few patents for fluid valves. I didn't just draw up the blueprints for this place. I personally oversaw the foundation pour, laid down the vapor barriers, and built the private dock leading out to Lake Washington with my own two hands. I handpicked every single load-bearing column to ensure my family had an unbreakable fortress. Irene loved this kitchen more than anything. I had custom cabinets built 2 inches lower than standard, tailored exactly to her height. I can still remember the two of us sitting on the unfinished subfloor, eating takeout pizza from a cardboard box, imagining the sound of our children running down the hallways. I built this home to be a sanctuary, a place of love, warmth, and family legacy. And now, sitting at the center of the fortress I poured my soul into, was a vanity-obsessed son who had failed at every business venture, lost all his money in cryptocurrency, and couldn't even reboot the home router. And he was using a patronizing tone to tell me it was time for me to get out. "Dad, I really think this is what's best for everyone," Kevin added, finally flipping his phone face down on the counter. He forced a fake, sympathetic tone, the kind you use with a toddler or a patient in hospice. "Your memory just isn't what it used to be. Last week you left the smart thermostat running all night, which is a major safety hazard. We just want you to be safe." "He's right, Arthur," Chloe chimed in, leaning forward. Her expensive designer bracelets made a sharp, clinking sound against the quartz countertop. The Ivy Center is a top-tier facility with 24/7 professional care. You'll be around people your own age, and you won't have to stress over maintaining this massive old house anymore. Safe. The word echoed in my mind, dripping with nauseating hypocrisy. I am a retired high-level engineer. My mind is sharper than a precision lathe. Just 2 years ago, I spent an entire month upgrading the home's smart system and security network to the latest encryption protocols. I even installed manual override breakers on the main electrical panel, just to eliminate any potential fire hazards. Poor memory? I remembered exactly how they ended up at my kitchen island in the first place. 3 years ago, during a torrential Seattle downpour, Kevin and Chloe showed up on my porch, completely broke. His so-called blockchain startup had collapsed. They had been evicted from their luxury downtown penthouse because they couldn't pay the rent. Chloe was crying so hard her makeup was ruined, swearing up and down that they only needed 6 months to save up for a down payment on a new place. They were drowning in high-end car loans and a lavish lifestyle they couldn't afford. I opened my doors to them. I gave them the entire second floor. I covered all the living expenses, the steep property taxes, and the utility bills. I let them live here completely rent-free just so they could get back on their feet. But as months turned into years, that tiny bit of gratitude completely evaporated. 6 months became a year, and 1 year became 3. The tears dried up, replaced by a toxic sense of entitlement. They took over the living room and packed my driveway with a leased Porsche Cayenne they could barely afford. They started hosting lavish dinner parties for their superficial influencer and socialite friends. And on those nights, Chloe would tell me in a polite but icy voice to stay downstairs in my bedroom, so my old flannel shirts and khakis wouldn't ruin the vibe of her party. They didn't care about my safety. They just wanted me out of the picture. They wanted to play the wealthy hosts of a multi-million-dollar lakeside estate without the inconvenience of the old man who actually built it standing in the way. The sheer audacity of it burned hot in my chest. A weaker man might have broken down in tears. A reckless man might have grabbed a cast-iron skillet and chased them out into the street. But I am neither weak nor reckless. In my line of work, you never start a demolition without knowing exactly where the load-bearing walls are. You assess the structure, calculate the stress points, and plan a flawless collapse. I let my shoulders slump. I forced my hands to tremble slightly, letting the dishcloth slip from my fingers onto the counter. I looked down at my worn slippers, playing the exact role they had scripted for me. "Maybe you're right," I murmured, making my voice sound weak and defeated. "This house really is getting to be too much for me. I need a little time to process this." Instantly, relief washed over their faces. Kevin let out a long breath, a smug smile breaking through his fake concern. Chloe couldn't even help but clap her hands together in a quick, victorious gesture. "Of course, Dad," Kevin said, standing up and patting my shoulder like he had just won a tough corporate negotiation. "Take the weekend to think about it, but we really need an answer by Monday so we can lock down that spot." Mission accomplished, they went right back to their breakfast, completely satisfied. I turned around and slowly shuffled toward the hallway, perfectly playing the part of a broken old man. But as I passed the entryway table, my eyes caught Chloe's Hermes Birkin bag, which was lying open on the mahogany surface. Tucked into the inside pocket was a thick manila envelope. The corner was sticking out, showing a blue notary seal from the state of Washington right next to a few words printed in bold black ink. Those few words made the blood run cold in my veins. I didn't stop, and I didn't stare. I kept shuffling right into my bedroom, but the very second I closed the door and heard the lock click into place, the fragile old man act completely vanished. The war had officially begun. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the teak floors, letting my anger harden into a cold, unbreakable focus. A few minutes later, there was a soft knock on the door. It was Kevin. He pushed the door open without even waiting for me to answer, stepping into my private space with a look of manufactured sympathy. He was holding a cheap, glossy brochure, which he gently placed on my nightstand. Printed on it in bright, overly cheerful font were the words, "Ivy Memory Care Center." He sat down beside me, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Dad, I know this is a lot to take in," he said softly. "But you have to understand, Chloe and I are just incredibly worried about you. You've been forgetting things so much lately. Just last week you left the kitchen stove running, and you forgot to lock the front door twice. It's just too dangerous for you to be alone in this massive house while we're at work. We love you too much to let something terrible happen." I looked at the brochure, and then I looked at my son. The lie came out so smoothly, so perfectly rehearsed, that I almost admired the sheer depth of his dishonesty. Forgetting things? Dangerous? I ridiculed every single word in my head. I am a retired senior mechanical engineer. My mind is sharper than a steel trap. To keep my brain active, I still solve complex fluid. Dynamics, calculus in my head. And the stove? I had replaced the old kitchen appliances 2 years ago with a top-of-the-line commercial induction cooktop. The moment a pan leaves the heating zone, the system automatically shuts off power within half a second. Starting a fire in that kitchen was a physical impossibility. As for the front door, I personally wrote the core code for the smart lock system, which automatically engages the deadbolt 30 seconds after the door closes. Of course, he didn't know any of this. Unless something in the house broke and he needed me to fix it like a free handyman, he never paid attention to a single detail of this home. The truth had absolutely nothing to do with my safety or my memory. It had everything to do with vanity and greed. 3 years ago, they had crawled to my doorstep entirely broke, drowning in debt, begging for a place to stay. And because he was my son, I didn't hesitate to welcome them into my home. But now, my very presence had become a roadblock to the lifestyle they wanted. They were desperate to play the part of high-rolling socialites in Seattle's wealthy circles, and an old man walking through the living room in a flannel shirt and worn work boots ruined the illusion of their self-made success. They wanted a multi-million-dollar lakeside estate, but they wanted to erase the man who built it. They wanted me gone, entirely wiped out of the picture. I forced my hands to tremble again. I reached out and took the brochure, letting my fingers shake against the cheap paper. I looked up at Kevin with wide, fearful eyes, playing the exact part of the helpless, panicked old man they desperately needed me to be. "Is it nice there?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, letting it sound faint and detached. "It's incredible, Dad," Kevin smiled, visibly relieved that I wasn't fighting back or making a scene. "They have beautiful gardens and a piano in the common room. You're going to make a ton of friends your own age. Just take a look through the brochure today, and we'll talk more about the move tonight when we get back from our dinner party." He patted my knee, stood up, and walked out, closing the door behind him. The very second the latch clicked into place, my trembling hands instantly became rock solid. Without a moment's hesitation, I tossed the insulting brochure right into the trash can next to my desk. I didn't need a care center, I needed a battle plan. I stayed in my room until I heard the heavy, distant rumble of the garage door closing. They were finally gone. I walked over to the window and peered through the blinds, watching the leased Porsche back down the driveway and disappear down the tree-lined street. The house sank into a deep, hollow silence. Now it was time for me to get to work. Since they were planning to lock me away and take over my home, I had to ensure all my legal documents were absolutely secure and untouchable. I needed to get my hands on the property deed immediately. The original was locked away safely in a downtown bank vault, but I kept a notarized copy right down the hall in my old study. I needed to review every single word of that title to make sure Kevin couldn't find a loophole with some shady lawyer. I stepped out of my bedroom and walked down the long, sunlit hallway. The oak floors gave a slight, familiar groan under my weight, a sound I had known for 35 years. I reached the end of the hall and placed my hand on the brass doorknob of my study. This was the room where I had drawn up hundreds of patent blueprints, where I had taught a 9-year-old Kevin how to budget his very first allowance, and where the records of my entire life's work were kept. This was my absolute private sanctuary, a room Chloe almost never stepped into because she complained it smelled like machine oil and musty old paper. I turned the handle, expecting the heavy oak door to swing open effortlessly. It didn't budge. I frowned and tried again, putting my shoulder against the wood and pushing hard. It was completely locked. But it wasn't just locked. When I leaned in closer to inspect the hardware, I realized the original standard lock had been completely removed. In its place was a high-security electronic keypad, combined with a heavy-duty physical deadbolt. My own study, the room containing my most private financial records and personal history, had been locked against me. I stood there in the quiet hallway, staring blankly at the shiny new brass lock as a cold wave of realization washed over me. I had only come looking for a simple piece of paper, but I had just stumbled onto something far more alarming. This wasn't just an eviction anymore. This was a hostile takeover. They had violated my personal sanctuary, the space filled with memories of Irene and the years of my hardest work. The sheer nerve it took to change the locks inside the house I built with my own hands ignited a fire inside me that I hadn't felt in decades. I ran my fingers over the cold metal surface of the new deadbolt. They thought a new lock was enough to shut me out of my own life. They thought I would just quietly pack my bags, hand over my keys, and fade away in some sterile care facility. They were dead wrong. I slowly pulled my hand away from the door and smiled. It was a dark, humorless smile. In his eagerness to discard his father, Kevin had forgotten a critical detail. To a mechanical engineer who knows exactly how mechanisms are put together, a lock is nothing more than a psychological illusion, and I knew exactly where my heavy-duty tools were kept. I didn't try to force the door open right then. I spent the rest of the afternoon quietly back in my bedroom, acting as if nothing had happened. Around 7 that evening, I heard the Porsche pull into the driveway. A few minutes later, Chloe clacked into the kitchen in her high heels, with Kevin close behind, arguing about which upscale restaurant they should go to over the weekend. I waited through the day, finally finding my opportunity on Monday morning. The moment they left the house again, I headed straight for the utility room at the back of the house. I pulled my old steel toolbox out from the bottom cabinet. It was heavily battered, its surface covered in dried paint from decades of hard work. The weight of it in my hands felt like an old friend returning to my side. I carried the heavy toolbox down the hallway, my boots making solid, quiet thuds against the wood floor. I stopped right in front of the study door, where the brand-new deadbolt gleamed in the dim light, almost mocking me. Chloe probably thought a heavy lock from a discount hardware store was enough to keep me out. I set the toolbox down, the metal hitting the wooden floor with a sharp, decisive clank. I flipped the latches and opened the lid, revealing rows of precision tools I had gathered over 40 years. I pulled out a specialized tension wrench and a fine lock-picking feeler gauge. They wanted to play dirty behind my back. Now it was my turn to see exactly what secrets they were hiding behind this door. My hands fell into a familiar, steady rhythm. Decades of working with intricate machinery had deeply engraved the muscle memory into my bones. I slid the tension wrench into the bottom of the keyway, applying a rotation pressure as light as a feather. Then I inserted the pick, gently lifting each brass pin inside the cylinder. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I counted silently, feeling the tiny clicks travel through the metal tools right into my fingertips. Chloe probably believed the words heavy duty printed on the plastic packaging meant it was unbreakable, but to someone who understands exactly how it was manufactured, it was a joke. Just 45 seconds after kneeling down, the final pin clicked into place. The cylinder gave a deep, satisfying turn. I pulled my tools out, stood up, and pushed the heavy oak door open. The hinges gave a soft hum, a sound I hadn't heard in months. I stepped over the threshold, my eyes slowly adjusting to the dim light filtering through the closed blinds. I reached out and flipped the wall switch, and the brass desk lamp flickered to life, casting a warm amber glow across the room. I froze in the doorway, taking a long moment just to process the absolute violation in front of me. There wasn't a single trace of what Chloe had called a minimalist content studio. No ring lights, no backdrops, nothing legitimate. Instead, my private study looked like it had been torn apart by a desperate burglar. My beautiful mahogany desk, an antique I had personally restored decades ago, was completely buried under mountains of scattered papers, empty coffee cups, and crumpled legal pads. But the sight that truly turned my stomach was over in the far corner. My 2 heavy steel filing cabinets had been violently dragged away from the wall. The heavy metal drawers were hanging open at awkward angles. Someone had used a crowbar or a heavy flathead screwdriver to violently break the built-in locks. The steel panels were deeply gouged and bent out of shape, leaving 40 years of my meticulously organized life completely exposed. My tax returns, old building permits, Irene's medical records, and my patent income statements had been ripped out of their folders and tossed onto the floor like worthless garbage. A suffocating wave of bitterness and profound betrayal washed over me. I slowly walked into the room, my boots crunching loudly against a pile of scattered bank statements. I stopped in the center of the study, remembering a rainy night over 30 years ago. Right in this room, at that exact desk, I'd pulled up a wooden chair for a 12-year-old Kevin. He had been so incredibly proud of the first few dollars he earned mowing a neighbor's lawn. I had bought him a little green ledger book and sat patiently by his side for 2 hours, teaching him how to balance accounts, how to understand the value of hard work, and the vital importance of financial integrity. I could still see him looking up at me with those wide, innocent eyes, hanging on my every word. I had believed with every ounce of my being that I was raising a man of honor. Now, looking at the violently pried open filing cabinets, that memory felt like a cruel, twisted joke. The boy who used to meticulously record a $5 lawn mowing job had grown into a man who would take a crowbar to his own father's private records, all while I sat in the next room eating their leftover cold oatmeal. This wasn't just an invasion of privacy, it was a complete destruction of every value I had ever tried to instill in him. They hadn't just searched this room, they had ransacked it with a frantic, greedy desperation. I forced myself to breathe steadily, pushing the sharp, emotional pain down, and replacing it with the cold, calculating mindset of an engineer facing catastrophic structural damage. I walked over to the mahogany desk and looked down at the chaotic mess of papers. They had been hunting for something specific. You don't violently destroy two heavy steel filing cabinets unless you are hunting for a very specific hidden document. I began carefully sorting through the wreckage on the desktop, moving aside crumpled notes and old coffee stains. Underneath a pile of useless utility bills, a familiar piece of heavyweight paper caught my eye. I slid it out. It was the property deed, specifically the notarized copy I kept on hand. My heart skipped a heavy beat before settling down as I recognized the watermark. Thank God my lawyer and longtime friend, David, had strongly advised me years ago to lock the original away in the downtown bank's safety deposit box. But the fact that Kevin had dug up this copy meant they were actively studying the legal boundaries of my ownership. I dropped the deed back onto the pile and kept searching. Right next to the keyboard of an old laptop they'd left behind, I noticed a small stack of recently printed emails. The paper still felt fresh and crisp. I picked it up and pushed up my reading glasses. These emails had been sent from Kevin's personal account, not his work one. I looked at the recipient address. It belonged to an executive at Summit Capital. I knew that name from the Seattle business scene. They weren't a legitimate real estate agency. They were a predatory investment firm notorious for aggressively buying prime properties in all-cash deals, bulldozing the existing structures, and rebuilding from scratch. My eyes swept across the printed lines, my vision sharpening from a massive rush of adrenaline. The Summit Capital representative was instructing Kevin on how to close a private $5 million all-cash deal. You don't just secure a $5 million buyout without any collateral, and Kevin didn't have a dime to his name. His Porsche was leased, Chloe's luxury goods were maxed out on credit cards, and he didn't own a single ounce of gold. The only asset he had access to was the very house I was standing in and the Mercer Island land beneath it. I read down to a highlighted section in the middle of the second page. The executive wrote, "We cannot move forward with this land acquisition unless you are the primary title holder or you have full legal control over the current owner." A sick knot twisted in my stomach as the full silhouette of their plot finally came together. They weren't just trying to put me away in a care facility. They were trying to sell my life's work to a ruthless corporation, using the cash to fund their endless entitlement. I threw the emails back onto the desk and yanked open the remaining drawers. I needed to see exactly how far my son was willing to go. I pulled open the bottom right drawer, which was packed with heavy legal folders. I slid the top one out and opened it under the amber light of the lamp. There was only one document inside. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "Conservatorship Petition and Durable Power of Attorney." My eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, every key phrase hitting my chest like a physical blow. This document would grant Kevin absolute authority over all my financial assets, real estate, bank accounts, and patent portfolios. But it didn't stop there. The second section shifted directly into the medical realm. It gave him the absolute right to make all healthcare decisions on my behalf, including the power to commit me to a long-term care facility against my will and dictate my end-of-life care. This wasn't just financial theft. This was the total erasure of my autonomy as a human being. They were drafting paperwork to strip away my voice, my freedom, and my basic human rights. I flipped to the final page and the breath caught in my throat. On the bottom line of the signature block, there it was, Arthur Pendleton. I stared at the ink. The cursive loops were a terrible, shaky attempt to mimic my handwriting. Kevin had clearly tried to trace my signature from an old holiday card. He had pressed down too hard, causing the ink to pool heavily at the ends of the letters. Next to the forged signature was a bright blue notary stamp, accompanied by a fraudulent diagnosis of severe cognitive decline from an online physician I had never heard of. It was the kind of rubber stamp diagnosis anyone could buy on the dark web for a fee. The forgery was sloppy, the work of a desperate amateur. But I knew enough about the modern legal system to understand how dangerous this piece of paper truly was. If Kevin walked into a courtroom with this document and put on a passionate, tearful performance, a busy judge might just sign off on the conservatorship. Once that massive legal machine started rolling, it could take me years and every dollar I had to fight it and prove it was a scam. I couldn't let this document see the light of day, but I couldn't destroy it either. It was the ultimate proof of their betrayal. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my smartphone. My hands were incredibly steady now, locked in place by a cold, calculating rage. I opened the camera app, making sure the flash was turned off. Hovering the phone over the forged documents, I tapped the screen to focus on the fake signature and the fraudulent medical diagnosis. I took 3 crisp, high-definition close-ups. Then I flipped back through the folder, photographing every single paragraph of the conservatorship petition. Next came the printed emails about the property sale. I was building an airtight case, brick by brick. I reviewed the photos in my gallery, zooming in to ensure every word was crystal clear. The evidence was secured. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and reached out to close the folder, needing to leave everything exactly as I had found it. But just as my fingers touched the heavy cardboard cover, a low rumble vibrated through the floorboards. It was the sound of the garage door opening. My heart hammered against my ribs. They were back early. Maybe their social brunch had ended ahead of schedule, or maybe they had been lying about where they were going. It didn't matter. They were pulling into the driveway right now. I had less than 30 seconds to get out of here before they walked through the mudroom door. I moved with a speed and agility I didn't know my 72-year-old body still possessed. I shoved the folder back into the bottom drawer and slammed it shut. I frantically swept the scattered bank statements and emails back into the chaotic pile they had made. I grabbed my tools from the desk and shoved them deep into my pockets. I switched off the desk lamp, plunging the study back into darkness. I slipped out into the hallway, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind me. I pulled the tension wrench and picked from my pocket, my hands moving purely on muscle memory at a frantic pace. I slid the tools into the brass deadbolt. I could hear the car doors slamming inside the garage. I heard the lock on the mudroom door click open. I worked the pins frantically inside the cylinder. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The mechanism caught. I turned the wrench, throwing the deadbolt back into place. Just as I slipped the tools back into my pocket, I heard Chloe loudly complaining about her new shoes pinching her feet. I walked quietly but swiftly down the hallway toward my bedroom. I slipped inside, closing the door gently, leaving it open just a tiny fraction of an inch. A second later, the hallway light clicked on, followed by the heavy thud of footsteps on the hardwood. I stood in the darkness, my chest rising and falling silently, gripping my phone tightly inside my pocket. The rest of that long Monday night passed in a blur of sleepless exhaustion. I lay in bed, listening to the muffled thuds of Kevin and Chloe walking around upstairs, their voices carrying through the ceiling, completely unaware of the storm brewing right beneath their feet. By the time Tuesday morning broke, painting the Seattle sky a pale, chalky gray, I had my script ready. At 7:30, I dragged my feet deliberately as I walked into the kitchen. Kevin was pouring his pour-over coffee. Chloe was scrolling through her phone, not even bothering to look up. I cleared my throat, making my voice sound weak and raspy. I told them my joints were flaring up terribly and that I had booked an urgent appointment with Dr. Higgins downtown. Kevin barely glanced at me, nodding impatiently, and told me to just call an Uber so I wouldn't get lost in the city. I nodded submissively, turning away to hide the fire burning in my eyes. The moment the ride-share car turned the corner, completely out of their sight, I gave the driver a very different address. We weren't going to a medical clinic. We headed straight to the high-rise offices of David Stanton, a premier attorney in downtown Seattle. David and I had been close friends for over 40 years, long before he wore custom suits and sat behind a mahogany desk overlooking the city skyline. He was a young legal consultant, hustling to help me file my very first valve patents. We had built our careers side by side in rainy Seattle. He had been a guest at my wedding, a comfort at Irene's funeral, and he was a man who possessed the ferocious instincts of a starving wolf when it came to a legal fight. If there was anyone on this earth I could trust completely to help me strike back against this betrayal, it was him. I walked into his downtown office suite without an appointment. His assistant, who had known me for a decade, took one look at the grim determination on my face and immediately waved me through the heavy double oak doors. David looked up from a stack of legal briefs. A warm smile spread across his sharp, weathered face, but it vanished the instant he saw my expression. I took a seat in the leather chair opposite him. I didn't waste time with small talk. I pulled out my phone, unlocked the screen, opened the photo gallery, and slid the device right across the polished wood of his desk. David picked up the phone, adjusting his silver-rimmed reading glasses. I watched his eyes scan the screen rapidly. I watched the warm, welcoming posture of an old friend completely evaporate, replaced by the icy, razor-sharp focus of a senior partner. He swiped to the next photo, then another. The air in the executive office grew heavy, the only sound being the distant hum of city traffic 14 floors below. When he finally reached the image of the forged signature and the fraudulent medical evaluation, a vein in his temple throbbed tightly. He set the phone down gently, slowly removed his glasses, and let out a long, deliberate breath. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but it was pure poison. "This is a major felony, Arthur. This is textbook fraud, elder abuse, and attempted grand larceny. I can have 2 police cruisers parked in your driveway in 15 minutes. We can have him in handcuffs before he finishes lunch. Let me make the call." He reached for the desk phone. I leaned forward, placing my hand firmly over his wrist, stopping his movement. "No, David," I said, my voice perfectly steady, entirely stripped of the weakness I had faked that morning. "Don't call the police. Not yet." David looked at me, his brow furrowed with confusion and a rapidly rising anger. "Arthur, he is trying to strip away your legal autonomy. He's trying to steal a multi-million-dollar property and lock you in a care facility against your will. You cannot shield him from the consequences of this. He crossed a line that can never be uncrossed with an apology." "I'm not shielding him," I replied, looking directly into my oldest friend's eyes. "Going to prison is too easy a punishment for what he deliberately planned to do to me. If he goes down right now, he'll get a public defender, cry in front of a judge about making a foolish mistake, and Chloe will play the tearful victim. They'll paint me as a confused, lonely old man who misunderstood their good intentions. No, I want to take away the only thing they actually love in this world. I want to take away their money, their social status, and their toxic arrogance. I am going to systematically dismantle their lives, piece by piece, using the exact legal machinery they tried to use on me." David slowly pulled his hand away from the receiver. He leaned back in his leather chair, a dark understanding dawning in his eyes. He knew me too well. He recognized the tone of a man ready to tear a structure down to its very foundation. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, his posture shifting from a protective friend to a strategic partner. I pointed at my phone on his desk. "You saw those emails with Summit Capital. Kevin is trying to force an all-cash buyout on the house, but a man doesn't commit a blatant felony just to upgrade his lifestyle. There is a desperate panic behind that forged signature. They need an astronomical amount of cash, and they need it right now. I need to know why. I need you to run a deep, completely off-the-books background check on their finances. I want to see every hidden bank account, every maxed-out credit card, and every outstanding debt they're hiding from me. Find out why they are so desperate for my house today." David nodded, turning toward his array of monitors. His fingers immediately began flying across the keyboard. "Give me a few hours, Arthur," he promised. "After lunch, I'll find their breaking point. I left David's office and spent the next few hours sitting on a bench in nearby Pioneer Square. I watched the city of Seattle move rapidly around me, completely oblivious to the silent storm raging in my chest. The damp Pacific Northwest chill seeped through my coat, but I couldn't feel a thing except a cold, heavy numbness. At exactly 2 in the afternoon, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a short text from David, just 2 words, "Come back." I stood up slowly, smoothed out the wrinkles in my coat, and walked back into the glass tower. When I stepped into his private executive office for the second time that day, the atmosphere was completely different. The blinds were tightly drawn, blocking out the daylight and casting long shadows across the room. His mahogany desk was buried under freshly printed financial statements, bank summaries, and detailed credit reports. David was rubbing his temples with both hands, looking like an exhausted man who had just sifted through a train wreck looking for survivors. He silently gestured for me to take a seat in the leather chair. I sat down, mentally bracing myself for the impact. David leaned forward, his hands tightly clasped over a thick stack of printouts. "Arthur," he began softly, his voice heavy with absolute disbelief, "I knew your son was living way beyond his means, but the brutal reality of their financial situation is worse than either of us could have imagined." He slid a crisp statement across the polished mahogany desktop. It was a consolidated debt summary. I looked closely at the bold black numbers printed at the bottom of the page. $320,000. I blinked twice, making absolutely sure my aging eyes weren't playing tricks on me in the dim light. $320,000 in unsecured credit card debt. That astronomical figure didn't even include the leased Porsche, currently sitting in my driveway, or their exorbitant daily living expenses. It was pure consumer debt, a terrifying financial ruin built entirely on high-interest plastic and arrogant delusions. "How is that even possible?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper in the quiet room. "They live in my house completely rent-free. I pay the property taxes out of my own pocket, and I cover every single utility bill every month. Where did all that money go?" David began rapidly flipping through the stacked pages, laying out the ugly details of their desperate, hidden lives. "Chloe has a severe addiction to shopping, or rather, an addiction to maintaining a fake identity," he explained, his face grim as his manicured finger tapped aggressively against a lengthy credit card statement. "She treats high-end luxury boutiques like a local grocery store. She's been spending tens of thousands of dollars every month on designer clothes, limited edition luxury bags, and incredibly expensive private beauty treatments, just to sustain her wealthy socialite illusion on Instagram. She even secretly opened 5 line of credit accounts under her maiden name to keep the invisible cash flowing. But her spending is only half of this disaster." David pulled another formal legal document from the messy pile. It was a copy of a confidential investigation notice from the Securities and Exchange Commission. Kevin's so-called cryptocurrency startup wasn't just a failed business venture, it was a Ponzi scheme. The SEC has been closing in on him for running a fraudulent initial coin offering. He didn't just lose his own money, he's facing massive margin calls. If he doesn't pay millions of dollars in fines and refund a portion of his investors' money, he is looking at up to 10 years in a federal facility. He hid all of this. Instead of scaling back their lifestyle or coming clean to you, they stubbornly doubled down. They used high-interest credit cards to plug the massive financial holes, pretending everything was fine while they were drowning under a mountain of compounding interest and late fees. I leaned deeply back into the leather chair, a sickening mixture of pure disgust and profound sorrow washing over me. I thought about the sweat, the blood, and the immense personal sacrifices I had made to build a truly stable life. 35 years ago, when Irene and I bought that empty plot of dirt on Mercer Island, we didn't have a single penny to spare. To save money, we lived entirely on cheap canned beans and white rice for 2 whole years. I drove an old pickup truck with a rusted-out chassis, because every single extra dollar went directly into structural lumber, heavy-duty steel nails, and poured concrete. I used to save quarters in a glass jar on the kitchen counter, just so I could take Irene out for a decent dinner on our anniversary. My blood had literally dripped into the dark soil of that land just to ensure my family would never have to experience the bitter chill of poverty. Today, that land was worth $5 million entirely because of decades of brutal, unglamorous, and absolutely relentless self-discipline. And now my own flesh and blood was actively plotting to steal my life's work just to fund his wife's shallow vanity and cover up his own pathetic, shameful cowardice. He simply couldn't face the reality of being financially ruined and going to prison. So without a second thought, he decided to sacrifice my peaceful retirement to pay for his crimes. They are completely broke, David pointed out bluntly. The credit card companies are preparing lawsuits. The SEC is closing their net. They are cornered animals. But that is exactly why this story goes from a tragic financial failure to a cold, calculated criminal conspiracy. David grabbed another folder and pulled out a complex legal document. "Do you remember those emails with Summit Capital you found in your study?" he asked quietly. I nodded slowly. David pointed the tip of his pen directly at the third paragraph. That forged conservatorship petition wasn't just for medical choices. Look right here. I leaned in to read the fine print, the breath catching painfully in my throat once again. The forged document was the exact key they needed to unlock a massive financial scheme. David tapped the petition with his heavy gold pen. They plan to sell the house directly to that vulture developer, Arthur, he explained, his tone a mix of professional disgust and personal anger. I stared at him, letting the words sink into my brain. They don't want you comfortable in your golden years. Kevin is using that forged conservatorship document to completely bypass your consent. The moment you are safely locked away in a cheap room at the Ivy Center, legally declared incompetent by his fraudulent medical paperwork, he intends to immediately execute this liquidation contract. David slid a breakdown sheet across the table, forcing me to look at the terrifying math. In the current Seattle market, your house plus that lakeside lot is worth a conservative $5 million, David continued, pointing at the top line of the spreadsheet. But a firm like Summit Capital loves a fire sale. They're willing to pay $4 million in an all-cash deal within 3 days. Kevin and Chloe plan to take that cash, immediately pay off the SEC fines, clear her credit card debt, and pocket the rest. They want to use the equity you built with your own 2 hands to keep funding their fake luxury lifestyle, pretending they're brilliant, self-made success stories. I stared at the paperwork, a cold wave of nausea settling deep in my stomach as the final sinister piece of their puzzle locked perfectly into place. "What happens to the house?" I asked, even though I already knew the devastating answer. David leaned back in his wide leather chair, letting out a heavy sigh as he rubbed his face. "It gets bulldozed immediately," he replied flatly, driving home the brutal reality of their plan. Summit Capital has zero interest in the structure. The moment the deal closes, the developers roll in with the heavy equipment. By the time you eventually close your eyes for the last time at the Ivy Center, your life's legacy will already be a glass and steel, modern box for some stranger. They're treating your home like a single-use lottery ticket. Cash it out, then discard you like trash. The sheer, unadulterated malice of their master plan hung heavy in the quiet executive office. I closed my eyes and took a very long, very deep breath. For the past 24 hours, a profound, agonizing heartbreak had been tearing at my chest. I had been grieving the loss of my family, mourning the realization that my own son had fundamentally betrayed my unconditional trust. But now, sitting here and staring at the exact dollar price he had placed on my freedom and the legacy of my hard work, that paralyzing heartbreak instantly vanished. In its place came a cold, hard, and terrifyingly calm clarity. The man currently sleeping under my roof, eating food bought with my money, and driving a luxury car while plotting my total ruin, was not the little boy I had patiently taught to balance a ledger. That innocent boy was dead and buried. The man sitting in my kitchen was a dangerous, greedy parasite, latched onto my life and waiting for the perfect moment to bleed me dry. He was a coward who refused to face the consequences of his own professional failures choosing instead to sacrifice his father on the altar of his own massive vanity. I thought about all those long, scorching summers I spent working overtime in the shop, churning out designs just to ensure his Ivy League college fund was paid for down to the last penny. I thought about the endless sacrifices Irene made, clipping coupons and sewing her own clothes just so we could pay off our mortgage 5 years early. We had given him everything we had to give, and his return on that investment was a forged signature designed to strip away my entire existence. I opened my eyes and looked straight at my old friend. I felt sharper than I ever had in my life. I am a professional mechanical engineer and a builder. I know exactly how to construct a fortress that stands tall against the world, and I know exactly how to dismantle a structure right down to the ground. I pushed the thick stack of fraudulent documents completely away from me. I didn't need to look at another piece of his pathetic, desperate deception. The rules of engagement had been clearly established by my own flesh and blood. He wanted to play a brutal game of total financial ruin, assuming I was just a weak, slow old man who would submissively surrender to his cruel manipulation. He had severely underestimated the man who raised him. I leaned forward, resting my forearms heavily on the smooth mahogany desktop, locking my unwavering gaze onto David. I was no longer a grieving father looking for comfort or explanations. I was a commander preparing for all-out warfare. We strike first, and we strike hard. I need you to answer one very important question for me right now, I said, my voice flat, sharp, and entirely stripped of any remaining warmth or hesitation. What is the absolute fastest we can legally sell this property to an all-cash buyer? Can we do it before Wednesday? David stared at me across the mahogany desk, his eyes narrowing into sharp slits as a slow smile spread across his weathered face. He understood exactly what I was asking. More importantly, he understood the sheer scale of the retribution I was planning. Selling real estate in less than 48 hours is usually impossible. But Seattle wasn't a conventional market. It was a boiling cauldron of tech giants and corporate developers. David reached for his heavy leather contact book at the corner of his desk. If you put it on the open market, it takes months, he said, lowering his voice. But if you want it sold today, absolutely no strings attached. With the cash wired directly into a secure trust account, we bypass families entirely and go straight to the sharks. He flipped rapidly through the thick pages until he found a specific card. He slid it out and tapped it against the desk. Apex Pacific, he read aloud. They're a massive corporate commercial real estate development firm. They've been aggressively buying up large residential lots around your area on Mercer Island for the last year, specifically to tear down the old homes and build ultra-luxury estates for tech billionaires. They pay all cash, and they buy strictly as is. That means they don't care about your paint color, old pipes, or a leaky roof. The only thing they want is the dirt beneath the foundation. I leaned in, the gears spinning rapidly in my mind. A corporate buyer was perfect. They had no emotions. They didn't care about family drama. They were a faceless machine operating entirely on legally binding contracts and strict deadlines. Call them, I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. Tell them the property is completely off market, but it's theirs for $5 million cash, provided they can close the deal by tomorrow evening. David picked up the phone and dialed the number. He hit the speakerphone button so I could hear the entire conversation. The phone rang twice before a smooth, professional voice answered. David introduced himself and skipped the pleasantries, laying the offer flat on the table. He gave the exact address and the asking price. I listened to the sound of the representative's keyboard clicking furiously on the other end. A few seconds later, the man confirmed the property sat directly in the bullseye of their most desired acquisition zone. The representative sounded eager. $5 million, he said, was well within their immediate cash reserves. However, he warned that even their accelerated closing process usually took at least 7 business days. I shook my head decisively at David. I didn't have 7 days. By next week, Kevin would have his forged paperwork filed, freezing my assets. I needed this sale finalized and the house completely out of my name before the sun came up on Wednesday morning. David raised a finger, signaling me to hold steady. He took a hard, demanding tone with the speakerphone. 7 days doesn't work for my client, David told the representative. My client is offering you an absolute premium, highly coveted waterfront corner lot. But this is an urgent timeline. You can have it for $5 million cash, wired into our trust account by tomorrow afternoon. But there is one highly strict condition attached to this transfer. There was a brief silence on the line before the representative asked him to elaborate. I leaned in closer to the microphone. I am the homeowner, I said, making sure my voice carried absolute authority. I will sign the deed over to your company tomorrow. However, your firm takes zero physical possession of the property early. You do not change the exterior locks, and you absolutely do not step onto the lawn to begin any demolition work until Wednesday morning at exactly 10 o'clock. Not a single minute before. The representative gave a soft chuckle, clearly confused by the bizarre restriction. That's a highly unusual request, sir, he responded. Usually sellers want at least a month to move out after closing. You're asking us to wait a mere 24 hours, but you're limiting our entry down to the exact minute? I stared blankly at the speakerphone. Those are the terms of the deal, I stated coldly. You get the land you've been desperate for, and I get the cash. But if a single one of your representatives shows up before 10 a.m. on Wednesday, the deal is completely void. Do we have an agreement? A long pause hung over the line. I could hear the faint murmur of the representative consulting a supervisor in the background. Finally, the voice came back over the speaker. We have a deal, Mr. Pendleton, the man said smoothly. We will draft the cash purchase agreement immediately and send it over to your counsel. We will fully respect your strict timeline. Wednesday morning at 10 o'clock sharp, Apex Pacific Development takes full legal and physical control of the property. I thanked the man, and David hung up the phone. The click of the receiver sounded like a gavel slamming down in a courtroom. The trap was officially set. The machinery of the law was now moving, and there was absolutely nothing Kevin or Chloe could do to stop a multi-million-dollar corporate entity from claiming what was legally theirs. David printed out the preliminary purchase agreement and slid it across the desktop. I picked up his gold pen and signed my name. This time, the signature was no sloppy forgery. It was bold, sharp, and carried the weight of final judgment. I stood up from the leather chair, feeling a strange sense of weightlessness. The house was gone. The fortress I had built for my family was destined to become a heap of splintered wood and twisted steel. But I didn't feel a drop of sadness. I felt justice. I gave David's hand a firm shake and walked out of his office. The real challenge was about to begin. I had to go back to that house, sit across from the parasites trying to ruin me, and play my part perfectly until the very end. I had to keep acting like the weak, forgetful old man, even if it was just for a little while longer. Tuesday morning arrived with a suffocating heaviness. I sat at the kitchen island, slowly stirring my plain oatmeal, while Kevin and Chloe rushed around me like they always did. Kevin was busy adjusting his silk tie, complaining about the traffic. Chloe was practically vibrating with excitement, talking rapidly on the phone with a friend about the upscale waterfront deck renovation project she was planning for the weekend. She had absolutely no idea that by Saturday that deck would be nothing more than smashed concrete and twisted rebar. I kept my head down, forcing my hands to tremble slightly whenever I lifted my spoon. I played the role of the defeated father flawlessly. I agreed to their timeline, nodded along to their instructions, and promised to start packing my suitcases that afternoon. By 8:30, they were out the door, leaving me alone in the quiet house. My timeline was incredibly tight. Apex Pacific was ready to wire the funds immediately, but corporate policy required one final, mandatory visual inspection of the interior before the payout could be released. For a demolition company that only planned to flatten the place, it was just a formality, a quick walkthrough to ensure the structure matched the county records. The inspector was scheduled to arrive at 1 p.m., right in the middle of their workday. At 5 minutes to 1, a white commercial pickup truck pulled into the driveway. A tall man wearing a high-visibility vest and a hard hat stepped out, carrying an electronic tablet. I met him at the door before he could even ring the bell. He introduced himself as Marcus, the chief field assessor for Apex Pacific. He was strictly business, showing zero interest in the custom oak cabinets I had built for Irene or the pristine hardwood floors. He tramped through the living room with heavy steps, tapping quickly away on his screen. When we reached the formal dining area, Marcus stopped in his tracks and let out a low whistle. He was staring directly at the massive, incredibly expensive imported Italian marble dining table and the matching velvet chairs that Chloe had recently bought by maxing out her credit cards. "This is some seriously high-end staging furniture, Mr. Pendleton," Marcus noted, looking around at the premium electronics and designer rugs scattered across the floor. "I assume you have a moving crew coming to clear all this out before the handoff tomorrow morning. Our demolition team operates on a brutally tight schedule. If the house isn't empty, we charge a massive premium as an extra junk removal fee." I stood by the marble table, running my palm across the cold, completely unpaid-for stone surface. I looked Marcus dead in the eye. "I have a private crew coming first thing in the morning to take my personal belongings," I explained calmly. "However, I want to be completely crystal clear about the terms of our contract. Your firm is buying this property strictly as is. Whatever I choose to take will be gone by 9:50 a.m. tomorrow. But at exactly 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, any furniture, electronics, or belongings left inside these four walls or on the lawn will legally be considered voluntary abandoned waste. You don't need to call me, and you don't need to ask for permission. Treat everything left behind as construction debris. It belongs to the developer, and your bulldozers are free to crush it into dust and bury it in the dirt." Marcus raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback by the pure coldness of my instructions. He had probably seen plenty of messy evictions, but a seller voluntarily abandoning tens of thousands of dollars worth of luxury furniture was unheard of. He tapped his tablet a few times and gave a firm nod. "Understood, sir. Anything left at 10 a.m. goes straight into the commercial dumpster." We walked up to the second floor so Marcus could verify the structural integrity of the attic roof joists. The inspection was tracking perfectly to plan. Just as I was about to lead him back downstairs to sign the final authorization paperwork, a sudden terrifying noise echoed through the house. It was the heavy, distinct rumble of the garage door opening. My blood instantly turned to absolute ice. It was only 1:30 in the afternoon. Kevin and Chloe never came home this early. But as the heavy thud of car doors slamming echoed through the walls, I recognized the sharp, unmistakable clack of Chloe's expensive high heels striking the concrete floor. For whatever reason, maybe to grab a forgotten gym bag or some documents, she was making a surprise raid during her lunch break. I had less than 10 seconds to react before she walked through the mudroom door and saw a demolition inspector in a bright orange safety vest standing in her hallway. Panic flared. I grabbed Marcus tightly by his heavy safety vest and silently yanked him toward the back staircase that led down to the rear deck door. I pressed a finger to my lips, demanding absolute silence. Marcus looked bewildered, but the sheer urgency in my grip forced him to comply without a word. We hurried down the wooden steps, our boots making barely a sound. I could hear the mudroom doorknob twisting open upstairs. I pushed Marcus out the back door, stepping onto the deck right behind him. I whispered a strict order for him to cut around the side of the house and drive away immediately, promising I would sign the final forms via email. Marcus gave a quick nod, jogged toward the side gate, and vanished behind the tall cypress hedge. I pulled the heavy deck door shut behind me, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. Grabbing a spare garden hose from the deck, I stepped through the back door and back into the kitchen, just as Chloe strolled casually into the space. She froze in her tracks, her eyes narrowing as her gaze flicked between my work boots and the hose in my hands. "What are you doing, Arthur?" she demanded. I forced my breathing to slow down, adopting a look of slight confusion. "I just had a plumber over," I lied smoothly. "The backyard spigot was leaking again, and I wanted to make sure it was taken care of before I leave tomorrow." Chloe rolled her eyes in sheer disgust, completely buying the pathetic story. "Whatever. Just don't track mud everywhere. I'm leaving in a second anyway." The master plan had survived. The rest of Tuesday afternoon crawled by with agonizing slowness. I retreated to my bedroom, keeping the door firmly shut to avoid any interaction with my daughter-in-law. I spent hours sorting through the incredibly few personal items I actually cared about keeping. I carefully wrapped Irina's framed oil paintings in soft cotton shirts, placing them gently into my worn leather suitcase. I packed my old pocket watch, my favorite flannel shirts, and a small wooden jewelry box containing the wedding ring I had given my wife over 50 years ago. That was the entirety of my life, condensed into 2 bags. The rest of the house, the physical structure, the expensive appliances, the imported rugs, meant absolutely nothing to me anymore. They were just materials, completely stripped of any real value. As the sun dipped below the horizon of Lake Washington, painting the Seattle sky in deep shades of purple and charcoal, the heavy front door clicked open and shut. Kevin was home from work. I sat quietly in my darkened room, listening to the muffled sounds of their evening routine drifting up through the floorboards. I could hear the distinct clink of wine glasses and the low murmur of Kevin complaining about the SEC auditors giving him a hard time. But the clearest sound of all was Chloe's voice. She was sitting in the living room talking to her superficial friends on speakerphone. Her sharp laughter cut right through the hallway, incredibly grating. I walked silently to the door, pressing my ear against the cool wood to listen. I could hear every single word perfectly. "I'm telling you, it's going to be absolutely amazing," Chloe practically shrieked into the phone. "The old man is moving out first thing in the morning. He's going to some care home across town. The second he's gone, we are completely gutting the downstairs. I'm hosting a massive demolition party next weekend to celebrate. We're tearing down the wall between the kitchen and the dining room for a total open concept space. We've got Michelin-level catering lined up, and I already ordered a dozen cases of imported champagne. This is a whole new beginning for us, a real step into the core social circle." I stood in the darkness, a silent smile spreading across my face. I felt a sense of pure disbelief at her arrogant delusion. She was planning a demolition party. She was going to invite her wealthy friends over to drink champagne and take a sledgehammer to a wall for fun. She had absolutely no idea that a professional demolition crew of 15 grown men was going to arrive in less than 18 hours to tear the entire structure down to the ground. She thought she was remodeling kitchen cabinets, while Apex Pacific's bulldozers were going to reduce them to kindling. The pure poetic irony of that foolish conversation was almost too delicious to bear. Woe stepped away from the heavy wooden door and walked back to the small writing desk in the corner. I reached into my bag and pulled out an encrypted digital tablet. David had given me this morning to ensure our communications remained completely secure from the home network. I hit the power button, and the screen glowed a pale blue, illuminating my face. I opened the secure email portal. Resting right at the very top of my inbox was a message from David Stanton, marked highly urgent. The subject line read, "Final closing documents for immediate execution." I took a deep, steadying breath and tapped the screen to open the legal documents. The paperwork was 40 pages long, filled to the brim with corporate jargon, liability waivers, and the absolute transfer of property rights. I read through the summary page, verifying every single detail of the deal we had negotiated. The purchase price was clearly listed right there, $5 million, paid entirely via an all-cash wire transfer. I scrolled down to the funding section. David had executed his side of the strategy flawlessly. The corporate funds weren't headed to my local checking account, an account Kevin would likely try to freeze or dispute using his forged legal documents. Instead, David had established a private offshore Swiss trust account in my name. The moment I signed that contract, the money would cross international borders, instantly vanishing into a secure financial fortress, completely untouchable by my son, the SEC investigators closing in on him, or the local court system. Kevin wanted to steal the equity in my home to pay off his massive criminal debts and credit card bills. Now, he wouldn't be able to find a single dime, even if he hired a team of private investigators. I flipped to the final page of the document. A glowing yellow box marked the exact spot requiring my digital signature to execute the binding contract. I paused for a mere fraction of a second. I looked around the room, taking in the crown molding I had personally installed, the sturdy window frames I had built, and the solid hardwood floors beneath my feet. This house held my greatest joys and my deepest sorrows. It was the physical manifestation of my entire adult life. But the people downstairs had already poisoned the well. They had turned my sanctuary into a prison of deception. I placed my finger against the smooth glass of the tablet and carefully traced my signature. I hit the submit button. A green check mark appeared on the screen, accompanied by a sharp, clear chime. The tablet displayed a confirmation message stating the wire transfer had been initiated and successfully completed. The funds were secure. I turned off the tablet and set it down. I looked out the window at the pitch-black Seattle night sky. The deal was done. Legal ownership had officially transferred. I was currently sitting in a structure that no longer belonged to me. The property was now the legal asset of a ruthless corporate demolition company, and the countdown to its destruction had officially begun. The morning sun broke through the curtains, casting a dismal, chalky gray light across my bedroom. Today was Wednesday, the day of reckoning. I got out of bed, my joints cracking in the quiet room, and walked over to the closet. Today required a very specific wardrobe. I passed right by the clean, neatly pressed shirts and reached for a faded, moth-eaten flannel shirt and a pair of trousers that were slightly too large for my frame. I wanted to look exactly like the defeated, fading old man they desperately needed me to be. I shuffled over to the corner of the room, where my 2 worn leather suitcases sat. I had packed them the night before, containing only the few precious memories I was taking with me. The heavy silence of the house was broken by the upbeat rhythm of music drifting up from the kitchen downstairs. They were actually playing celebratory music. I gripped the handles of the suitcases. I forced my posture to slump, letting my chin drop toward my chest. I practiced a long, heavy sigh before opening the bedroom door. I dragged the suitcases down the hallway, deliberately letting the hard leather thud heavily against the wooden stairs. Every step I took was a carefully calculated performance. When I finally reached the bottom of the stairs, I hauled my bags into the bright kitchen. Kevin and Chloe were standing by the island, sipping expensive espresso. They practically radiated a nauseating, energetic excitement. Chloe was wearing a brand-new designer dress, no doubt purchased on another maxed-out credit card, while Kevin carried himself with a smug, deeply relaxed posture I hadn't seen since he moved in 3 years ago. They looked exactly like people who had just won the lottery, completely oblivious to the fact that the winning ticket in their hands was an absolute fake. Chloe was the first to spot me. She immediately set her coffee cup down and rushed over. Her face twisted into an exaggerated, sickeningly sweet mask of sympathy. She threw her arms around my shoulders in a deeply hollow embrace. I stood completely still, letting her expensive perfume wash over me, fighting every single instinct, screaming inside me to push her away. I could feel the absolute fraudulence of her hug. It was the kind of embrace you give a stray dog before dropping it off at the animal shelter. "This really is for the best, Arthur," Chloe said in a patronizing coo, stepping back and patting my arm condescendingly. "You're absolutely going to love the Ivy Center. You'll make so many new friends there, people who can actually keep up with you. You don't have to stress about a single thing here. Kevin and I are going to take wonderful care of the place. We're planning some incredible upgrades to the space. It's going to be a completely fresh start for all of us." I looked down at the floor, forcing my hands to tremble as they rested on the suitcase handles. I fought down a powerful urge to laugh right in her perfectly manicured face. A fresh start. She had absolutely no idea how incredibly accurate that statement was about to become. In exactly 2 hours, her fresh start would involve a crew of burly construction workers tearing down the very cabinets she was leaning against with sledgehammers. I gave her a weak, pathetic nod, playing my role to absolute perfection. I mumbled a faint "thank you," even letting my voice crack slightly for dramatic effect. Kevin checked his reflection in the stainless steel refrigerator door, adjusting his silk tie with pure vanity. He walked over to the island and picked up his expensive leather briefcase. He didn't look sad. He didn't look conflicted. He looked profoundly relieved, as if he had just successfully disposed of a bag of rotting trash. He turned toward me, clapping his hands together with a sharp smack that echoed through the spacious kitchen. All right, Dad, Kevin said, glancing down at the heavy gold watch strapped to his wrist. Chloe and I really need to get moving. I have a board meeting this morning that I absolutely cannot miss. The care home shuttle is scheduled to pick you up at 9 o'clock sharp, right? Keeping my head low, I gave another slow, defeated nod. Yes, I whispered softly. The shuttle gets here at 9. I'll just sit right here by my bags and wait for them. Kevin grinned, flashing a predatory smile that didn't even come close to reaching his cold eyes. Good. That's perfect. The facility director said the intake process is incredibly straightforward. You just hand over the paperwork when you get there. Oh, hold on a second. He paused, reaching into the interior pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out his expensive leather wallet and flipped it open. I watched through lowered eyelashes, wondering what final line he was about to deliver. What he did next was so incredibly insulting, so deeply demeaning, that it instantly vaporized the last microscopic shred of pity that might have accidentally survived deep within me. He pulled out a crisp piece of paper currency. Walking over, he casually shoved the cash into the front pocket of my faded flannel shirt, giving my chest a patronizing pat. Here's a little something so you can get yourself a nice treat from the vending machines, he said smoothly. It was a crisp, brand-new $100 bill. That was his pathetic severance package for trying to steal a $5 million house. Have a good rest of your life, Dad, he added carelessly. Then, without looking back a single time, my son and his greedy wife walked out the door, leaving me completely alone in the kitchen. I listened to the heavy garage door close shut. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out the $100 bill and let out a genuine, terrifying smile. The ultimate demolition could now begin. I stood completely alone in the absolute silence of the kitchen, the crisp $100 bill resting lightly in my palm. I looked down at the green ink, running my thumb over the printed numbers. $100. It was an amount of money so incredibly pathetic, so profoundly insulting, that it briefly took my breath away. This was the final price Kevin had placed on my entire existence. This was the grand gesture of fake generosity he made after methodically plotting to steal a $5 million estate. He honestly believed that sliding a crisp bill into the faded pocket of my old flannel shirt would miraculously absolve him of his crushing guilt. He thought this money would buy him peace of conscience while he signed the forged documents to lock me away in a state medical institution. I thought about the days I spent working under the scorching sun, the endless all-nighters logged in front of a computer screen just to ensure he had a flawless Ivy League college fund until my eyes bled. I remembered personally handing him the keys to his first car. I remembered paying his college tuition in full, and now he was throwing me vending machine money to go quietly into the night. I slowly folded the bill in half, then in half again, shoving it deep into my pocket. Right then and there, I made a silent, unbreakable vow to myself. I would never spend a single cent of this insulting handout on myself. I was going to use this exact bill to generously tip the foreman of my moving crew. It was the only fitting destiny for such dirty money. I turned away from the island and walked slowly toward the front of the house. I didn't need to drag my feet anymore, but my body was still riding the residual adrenaline of the performance. I walked into the expansive formal living room and stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. Reaching out, I gently pulled back the edge of the heavy silk curtains Chloe had recently purchased on another maxed-out credit card. I looked out through the immaculate glass. The wide driveway was bathed in bright morning light. The heavy white garage door was completely open, revealing their leased silver Porsche Cayenne. Kevin was sliding into the driver's seat, adjusting his expensive tailored suit jacket so it wouldn't wrinkle. Chloe was settling into the passenger side, casually checking her makeup in the glowing vanity mirror and adjusting her oversized designer sunglasses. Looking from the outside, anyone driving down our quiet suburban street would have seen the absolute perfect picture of modern American success. A beautiful, upwardly mobile young couple preparing to leave their massive estate to conquer the corporate world. But it was a total fabrication. The luxury car was leased. The designer clothes were unpaid for. The house they proudly claimed ownership of was legally gone, and he was running from millions of dollars in federal fines. They were nothing more than two deeply desperate actors in expensive costumes, completely unaware that the theater they were performing in had been scheduled for immediate demolition. It was a pathetic charade that was about to come to a very sudden end. The smooth engine purred as the Porsche slowly backed down the driveway, rolling over the pristine concrete I had meticulously poured and leveled 30 years ago. I kept my eyes locked on them, waiting for even a single sign of hesitation, guilt, or regret. I waited to see if Kevin would hit the brakes, if he would look back just once at the beautiful home where he grew up, or perhaps cast a final glance toward the window to silently say goodbye to his father. He did nothing. He didn't step on the brakes, and he didn't turn his head. He simply shifted into drive and pressed the gas. The silver car glided down the quiet street, passing manicured lawns and towering Douglas firs. I kept my eyes on the vehicle until it neared the main intersection at the end of the block. The red brake lights flashed briefly in the sunlight as he paused at the stop sign. Then the right turn signal blinked. The Porsche rounded the corner and vanished completely from my sight, swallowed up by the morning commute. They were officially gone. The neighborhood fell silent again, completely oblivious to the coming chaos. The very second that silver car disappeared behind the distant tree line, a profound physical transformation swept through my body. The hunched, defeated posture I had carefully maintained all morning vanished instantly. I rolled my shoulders back, feeling the familiar strength return to my spine. I lifted my chin high and took a deep, clear breath of fresh air. The trembling in my hands, the signature of a desperate victim, stopped completely. The weak, confused old man was dead and buried. I was Arthur Pendleton once again. I was the builder of this home, the undisputed master of the dirt beneath my feet, and the sole architect of their upcoming ruin. I turned away from the front window and walked back to the center of the living room. Reaching into my pocket, I pulled out my smartphone. I bypassed my contacts list and manually dialed a 10-digit number I'd committed to memory the day before. The phone barely finished its first ring before a deep, gravelly voice answered on the other end. It was the dispatch manager for the heavy-duty logistics moving company David had recommended. I didn't say hello. I didn't waste a single second on polite morning pleasantries. The time for acting was over. The time for demolition had arrived. Taking one final look around the lavish, over-decorated room, my voice was flat and ice-cold. "Bring the trucks in." I hung up and slid the phone back into my pocket. The silence in the house was absolute. But it was only a temporary peace. I stood near the front window, watching the clock tick forward. At exactly 8:30, the quiet street was awakened by the massive roar of heavy diesel engines. I watched through the glass as 3 massive moving trucks turned the corner onto my street, rolling down the road in a tight convoy. The air brakes hissed loudly as they lined up perfectly against the curb, completely blocking the front of the property. The heavy metal doors slammed open, and 15 burly men in heavy work boots and gray uniforms stepped down. They moved with the sharp efficiency of a military unit, prepared for a rapid evacuation. The foreman leading the crew was a massive man with a thick beard and a clipboard tucked under his arm. He strode up my driveway. Before he could even reach the steps, I threw the front door open. I didn't bother with small talk. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the crisp $100 bill Kevin had condescendingly shoved there 30 minutes prior, and slapped it right onto his clipboard. The man looked down at the money, then looked up at me with a surprised expression. "That's just a tip to make your men move twice as fast," I told him, my voice carrying the authority of a veteran engineer and property owner. "I have an incredibly strict deadline today, and I need this evacuation executed flawlessly." The foreman gave a sharp nod, pocketed the cash, and turned to blow a loud whistle to his crew. The men swarmed onto the lawn, carrying heavy dollies, thick moving blankets, and massive rolls of packing tape. I raised my hand in the ground foyer, demanding their attention. The 15 men stopped and looked at me, waiting for instructions. "Listen to me very carefully," I directed, making sure my voice echoed clearly through the space. You're not clearing out the entire house. You're only removing specific items that I point out to you. If I do not explicitly tell you to pack it, do not touch it. Do not even look at it. Leave it exactly where it sits. I led them through the house, pointing out the true treasures of my life. I directed one crew to the dining area, ordering them to carefully wrap and box the antique rosewood display cabinet my late wife had left behind. I watched them securely pack Irene's delicate china, treating every piece with absolute respect. I sent another team down to the garage and the boat dock, commanding them to load every single piece of heavy machinery, power tool, and hand wrench I owned. These were the tools that built this house, and they were leaving with me. I had them pack the heavy oak desk from my study, completely ignoring the chaotic pile of Kevin's legal documents scattered across the floor. The men worked at a breathtaking pace. I walked from room to room, watching 40 years of my history systematically boxed up and carried out the front door. As my true belongings disappeared into the bellies of the massive moving trucks, the absolute absurdity of Kevin and Chloe's fake life was completely exposed. I explicitly told the movers to bypass Chloe's imported Italian marble dining table. I told them to ignore the massive $10,000 85-inch television hanging on the living room wall, and left the $8,000 velvet sectional sofa sitting right where it was. When the movers went upstairs, they walked right past Kevin's primary suite, leaving their designer clothes, expensive electronics, and overflowing jewelry boxes completely untouched. One of the younger movers stopped in the living room, looking bewildered as he stood next to an incredibly tall, highly expensive abstract sculpture Chloe had placed by the stairs just last month. "Sir, do you need us to wrap this statue up?" the young man asked, wiping sweat from his forehead. I looked at the ugly piece of art, knowing she had charged it to a high-interest credit card just weeks ago. I shook my head slowly. "No," I replied, my tone flat and uncompromising. "Leave the statue, leave the velvet sofa, leave the marble table. That is not my property. That is nothing but a pile of debris waiting for the landfill." The young movers shrugged and turned back to haul my solid wood bookshelves. By 9:15, the house felt entirely different. The soul of the home, the items that actually carried weight and memories, was completely gone. All that remained was a hollow, echoing shell filled with expensive stage props for a play that had been permanently canceled. The foreman walked up to me in the empty hallway, wiping his hands on his uniform pants. He handed me the clipboard to sign off on the loaded inventory. "Everything you requested is locked, loaded, Mr. Pendleton," he reported professionally. "The trucks are full and ready to head to your secured storage facility." I signed the final release forms and thanked him sincerely. As the 15 men walked out the front door and climbed back into their massive trucks, I knew my morning was far from over. I stood in the middle of the gutted living room, surrounded by Chloe's unpaid luxury furniture. The digital clock ticked closer to 10 o'clock. Apex Pacific's demolition crew would be arriving soon, and they would be more than happy to crush all these expensive furnishings into dust. But I had a better, far more retributive plan for their most prized possessions. I reached into my pocket, pulling out my smartphone for the second time that morning. David hadn't just uncovered their massive credit card debt and SEC fines. He had also provided me with the direct contact information for the aggressive collection agencies and repossession firms that were frantically hunting them down. I scrolled through the entries, found the specific number for the asset recovery firm handling Chloe's primary delinquent accounts, and hit call. The absolute destruction of their fake empire was about to get incredibly personal. The call went through, and a sharp, professional voice answered immediately. I identified myself as the legal owner of the property where Chloe was residing. I informed the recovery agent that the debtor was currently away from the residence, but that I was standing in the living room looking directly at tens of thousands of dollars worth of unpaid merchandise and leased furniture. I told her that I would be permanently vacating the property in less than an hour, and if her team wanted to reclaim their assets before the building was legally handed over to corporate developers for immediate demolition, they needed to arrive right now. The woman on the line didn't hesitate for a single second. She verified the address and told me she happened to have two trucks operating just a few miles away. She issued an emergency priority dispatch order to them on the spot. I hung up, walked over to the island, and poured myself a glass of tap water. Leaning against the counter, I watched the digital clock on the oven tick forward. Just past 9:15, the quiet suburban street was disrupted once again. This time, it wasn't the clean, organized moving company trucks. Two rugged flatbed tow trucks and a large unmarked box van tore into my driveway, their tires screeching aggressively against the concrete. Several men wearing heavy canvas jackets jumped out, carrying heavy-duty tie-down straps, power drills, and moving blankets. They looked rough, efficient, and completely out of patience. The lead repo man was a short, stocky individual holding a thick binder stuffed with collection notices and asset lists. He marched straight to my front door, which I held wide open to greet him. He demanded Arthur Pendleton, and I handed him my state ID, proving I was the owner of the property. He reviewed my credentials, then showed me the itemized list of Chloe's outstanding debts. It was a massive directory of pure vanity. I stepped aside, making a wide gesture with my arm, inviting the recovery team into the house. I told the leader that as the sole legal homeowner, I was granting them full, unrestricted access to repossess every single item on their list. I warned him that they had exactly 35 minutes to clear the house before the property was legally turned over to a demolition crew. At the mention of the word demolition, the man's eyes widened slightly, and he immediately barked orders to his crew. The repo men swarmed the living room like a pack of angry locusts. This time there were no protective blankets, no careful packing, and no gentle handling of fragile goods. This was a swift, calculated strip-down of outstanding assets. They moved with a cold, relentless speed, tearing through every single room and seizing every high-end piece of merchandise my daughter-in-law had fraudulently acquired, just to show off to her superficial friends. I stood by the front window, taking a slow sip of water, watching her fake country club lifestyle get systematically dismantled. Two men grabbed the expensive $8,000 velvet sectional sofa. They didn't even bother to wrap it. They flipped it onto its side, shoved it roughly through the front door frame, and dragged it straight into the back of the box van. Another crew went directly for the 85-inch flat-screen television mounted on the living room wall. Chloe used to brag about that TV constantly, claiming it was an anniversary surprise from Kevin. In reality, it was financed on a predatory interest rate, and she hadn't made a single payment in 4 months. The men attacked the drywall with power drills, ripping out the mounting brackets in seconds and leaving gaping holes in the wall. They carried the massive black screen out without a hint of hesitation. Next came the formal dining room. That imported Italian marble table, the centerpiece of the dinner parties where I had been barred from attending, was broken down in minutes. The men unbolted the heavy stone top from its brass legs, loaded the pieces onto reinforced dollies, and rolled them right out the front door. They took the matching velvet chairs. They took the abstract sculpture from the hallway. They even marched upstairs into the primary suite, stripping away her precious custom mattress and the expensive mahogany bedroom set. I watched them peel back every single layer of her manufactured wealth, exposing the completely hollow, bankrupt core of their financial reality. They weren't just taking furniture, they were stripping away the armor she used to cover up a deeply desperate insecurity. By 9:45, the recovery team had secured the last outstanding asset into their trucks. The foreman handed me a brief acknowledgement receipt, gave me a quick nod, and ordered his men to pull out. I watched the trucks back out of my driveway, their cargo bays stuffed with the physical evidence of Kevin and Chloe's ruined lives. As the roar of their engines faded down the street, a dead silence settled over the property. I turned around and looked at the interior. The house was completely gutted. The walls were bare, the floors were empty, and the space felt absolutely massive. Without the expensive rugs, the velvet sofas, and the designer staging, it was nothing more than a hollow box of timber and drywall. I walked slowly through the abandoned living room, my work boots making heavy, echoing thuds against the oak floorboards. The sound bounced off the bare walls, a steady rhythm celebrating my victory. I had dismantled their world. I walked into the kitchen and set my glass down on the granite counter. The house was dead. It was no longer a home. It was just a shell waiting for the final blow. The digital clock on the oven jumped to 9:50. The deadline was closing in. I walked to the front door and looked out the bay window. A black corporate SUV was turning onto my street, closely followed by a pickup truck hauling a heavy flatbed trailer. The new owners had arrived. The black SUV pulled smoothly into the empty driveway, its heavy tires crunching loudly against the loose gravel. Right behind it, the heavy-duty pickup truck brought the flatbed to a structured stop. I looked down at my watch. The digital display flipped to exactly 10 o'clock a.m. The deadline had arrived with absolute precision. I opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch, feeling the rare warmth of the Seattle sun against my face. 4 men wearing bright orange safety vests and heavy yellow hard hats climbed out of the vehicles. Leading them was Marcus, the field assessor who had conducted the quick walkthrough the day before. He was carrying a thick plastic clipboard and a pair of heavy-duty bolt cutters. Marcus walked up the concrete path, his heavy boots echoing through the quiet suburban morning. He stopped at the base of the porch steps, looking up at me with a strictly professional, completely detached expression. "Morning, Mr. Pendleton," he said, his voice carrying clearly over the low rumble of the idling trucks. "It's 10 a.m. sharp. Apex Pacific is officially prepared to assume full physical and legal control of the property, per our signed agreement. Has the interior been entirely cleared of all personal property?" I reached into the pocket of my faded flannel shirt and pulled out the heavy brass key ring. It held the key to the front door, the deadbolt to my study, the rear deck door, and the heavy garage door remote. For 35 long years, those pieces of cut metal had represented my absolute authority over this sanctuary. I looked at them for a fraction of a second, feeling nothing but a profound sense of relief. I walked down the 3 wooden steps and dropped the heavy keyring straight into his waiting palm. The metal clinked sharply against his calloused skin. "The house is completely yours," I replied calmly. "Everything I care about is already gone." Marcus gave a sharp nod and immediately turned to the crew behind him. He raised a hand and blew a short, piercing whistle. The 3 construction workers sprang into action like a set of loaded springs. They jogged to the back of the pickup truck, unloading heavy sledgehammers, massive crowbars, and thick industrial demolition drills. The illusion of suburban peace was instantly shattered by the loud, aggressive sounds of systematic destruction. One of the laborers marched right up the porch steps, bypassing me entirely, and jammed a heavy power drill into the hinges of the solid oak front door. The piercing shriek of grinding metal cut through the air as he rapidly stripped the heavy screws straight out of the timber. I stood on the walkway, watching another worker approach the pristine white picket fence lining the front lawn. It was the fence Irene had wanted 30 years ago. I had built it for her with my own 2 hands, repainting it every single spring. The worker swung a massive steel sledgehammer in a wide, incredibly violent arc. The heavy metal head struck the wooden post with a sickening, splintering crash. The timber snapped violently, and a large section of the beautiful fence collapsed instantly into the green grass. They weren't just tearing down a house. They were erasing its entire history. Within 5 minutes, the heavy front door was completely unhinged and tossed onto the flatbed trailer like scrap metal. Another worker was already unscrewing the glass panels from the massive living room window, exposing the hollow interior directly to the elements. This property was no longer a home. Legally and physically, it was now an active, highly hazardous demolition zone. Yellow caution tape was violently unrolled and tied off between the remaining fence posts and the towering Douglas firs in the front yard. Marcus walked past me, stepping over the empty front frame into the gutted living room. I followed slowly behind him, the soles of my boots crunching over shards of glass and splintered wood scattered across the entryway. Marcus stopped in the center of the vast space, hands on his hips. The repossession crew had cleared out all the expensive furniture, leaving the room largely bare. However, right in the middle of the floor sat a pathetic, chaotic mountain of leftover personal belongings. Kevin and Chloe hadn't packed a single box before leaving for work. Their highly expensive designer clothes, cheap imported electronics, countless high heels, and ridiculous decorative trinkets were piled together in a massive hill of junk. These were the items the collection agency couldn't legally seize because they weren't tied to specific debts as collateral. Marcus pointed his pen at the heap of clothing and electronics. "What do you want us to do with all this?" he asked, turning back to face me. "Our contract says whatever is left inside is considered abandoned waste. Do you want my men to throw it straight into the commercial dumpster out back?" I stared at the pile of tailored suits and brightly colored dresses. Throwing them neatly away would hide the reality of their absolute ruin from the neighborhood. I slowly shook my head. "Don't put it in the dumpster," I directed, pointing a rock-steady finger toward the open, doorless entrance. "I want you to haul that pile out onto the front lawn. Leave it right out there in the dirt, completely exposed to the street. That is not my property, and I don't care what happens to it." Marcus shrugged. "You heard him," he shouted to his crew. "Bag that stuff up and haul it outside." The workers immediately ripped thick black industrial trash bags from their tool belts. They began roughly shoving handfuls of expensive silk ties, designer dresses, and tangled power cords into the plastic. They dragged the black bags out and dumped them mercilessly onto the front lawn. I turned and walked away from the wreckage, heading toward a luxury private car that had been waiting for me at the curb. I stepped inside, leaving the demolition site behind. The soft leather seats of the private rental enveloped me as we glided smoothly out of the neighborhood. I didn't look out the back window. There was absolutely nothing left on that street worth a second glance. The house I had painstakingly built with my own hands was already undergoing a violent transformation, returning to the raw dirt it once was. I stared straight ahead, watching the familiar suburban streets give way to the towering glass and steel structures of downtown Seattle. The midday traffic was a chaotic river of movement, but inside the well-insulated cabin, I sat in perfect silence. The suffocating weight of betrayal that had pressed on my chest for days was finally gone, replaced by a deep, echoing satisfaction. I instructed the driver to head to a specific address in the heart of downtown, the Fairmont Olympic Hotel. It was an iconic luxury landmark, the kind of place where wealthy corporate executives and visiting dignitaries stayed. Kevin and Chloe always talked about wanting to spend a weekend there, but their maxed-out credit cards could never cover the steep security deposit. I, on the other hand, held a brand-new offshore Swiss trust account with $5 million in it. I stepped out of the car, gave the driver an incredibly generous tip, and handed my 2 worn leather suitcases to the sharply uniformed bellhop. The hotel lobby was a masterpiece of polished marble, crystal chandeliers, and soft classical music. I walked straight to the concierge desk and booked their finest penthouse suite, paying the $2,000 nightly rate up front without blinking. The price was staggering, but I considered it a minor investment for absolute peace of mind. The bellhop escorted me to the top floor, throwing open the heavy double doors to reveal a massive, sun-drenched living space. The suite featured floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a panoramic view of the entire Seattle skyline. The furnishings were exquisite, made of rich mahogany and supple leather. This level of absolute luxury completely put to shame the pathetic, debt-fueled illusion my son had tried to build. I tipped the bellhop with the last piece of cash from my wallet, locked the heavy suite door, and walked over to the elegant bar in the corner of the room. I reached for a crystal decanter filled with aged premium bourbon, a bottle of Macallan 25. I poured the golden liquid into a heavy-bottomed glass, the spirit catching the afternoon sun. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The dark liquor burned a warm, satisfying path down my throat, completely settling my remaining nerves. Carrying my glass, I walked over to the massive oak desk facing the skyline window. I set the bourbon down, unzipped my small leather travel bag, and pulled out my laptop. I opened the laptop and waited for the screen to boot up. When my son and his greedy wife assumed I was a confused old man who didn't understand modern technology, they severely underestimated my incredibly meticulous nature. Late Monday night, while they were sound asleep, Dreaming of their future renovation plans, I had slipped out the front door dressed in dark clothing. I carried a tall ladder and a small battery-powered, high-definition 4K micro-surveillance camera. Walking across the quiet street, I climbed high into the thick branches of a massive ancient Douglas fir, directly opposite my property. I spent nearly an hour carefully mounting the tiny device high up in the dense foliage, completely hidden by the summer leaves. I adjusted the lens angle to provide a perfect, unobstructed wide view, covering the entire front yard, the driveway, and the main entrance of the house. I even camouflaged the camera housing with brown tape to blend seamlessly with the bark. Now, sitting comfortably in my air-conditioned penthouse miles away, I clicked the icon for the secure application on my desktop. The software loaded rapidly, connecting to the wireless cellular signal of the hidden camera. A loading wheel spun briefly in the center of the screen, and then the high-definition live feed flickered to life. I leaned back in the comfortable leather chair, resting my hands on the desk, watching the grand show of consequences unfold in real time. The camera angle was flawless. I could see the pile of black trash bags stuffed with Chloe and Kevin's expensive designer clothes, scattered pathetically in the dirt of the front lawn. Behind the bags, the demolition crew was working with breathtaking efficiency. A massive yellow excavator had already arrived on site. Its heavy metal tracks crushed the green turf I used to water every morning. The massive mechanical arm reached toward the roof of the house. I watched through the high-definition feed as the steel bucket aggressively scraped the shingles, ripping them away in massive chunks. The wooden roof trusses snapped and collapsed inward, sending a thick cloud of gray debris into the bright blue sky. The house was being systematically consumed, reduced from a multi-million-dollar estate to a chaotic heap of industrial rubble. Time seemed to blur. I sat there, completely captivated by the absolute finality of the destruction. Hours passed. The bright afternoon sun began to sink toward the western horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the cluttered wasteland that used to be my perfect front yard. The digital clock in the corner of the laptop screen blinked steadily. The numbers jumped to 5:15 p.m., then 5:20. It marched forward, relentlessly. The demolition crew began packing up their heavy tools for the day, leaving the hollowed-out, roofless shell of the house standing bare and broken in the fading light. The sun began to set, painting the sky in deep shades of crimson and dark orange. 5:30 approached. The trap was about to spring shut. I reached out, picked up the crystal glass, and took a slow, satisfying sip of the premium bourbon. The amber liquid slid smoothly down my throat, a warm comfort that contrasted sharply with the cold, calculated reality unfolding on my laptop screen. The digital clock in the corner of the screen flipped precisely to 5:45 p.m. The long shadows of the Seattle sunset stretched across the barren, chaotic landscape. I leaned closer to the glowing display, my eyes locked onto the high-definition live feed from the hidden camera. The quiet suburban street remained still for a long few minutes, and then the sleek front end of their leased silver Porsche slipped into the frame. The car moved smoothly along the asphalt, looking entirely out of place against the backdrop of industrial violence. I watched the vehicle slow down, the red brake lights illuminating as it approached the property line. The car came to an abrupt, sudden halt right in the middle of the street. From my vantage point in the penthouse, I could vividly imagine the absolute chaos sweeping through my son inside that luxury cabin. He had expected to pull into a smooth, freshly washed concrete driveway. Instead, he was staring at a violently churned-up patch of raw dirt, deep tire ruts, and gray gravel chunks. The heavy excavator had completely obliterated the entrance to the property hours ago. The silver car idled in the street for a full minute. Finally, the driver's side door slammed open. Kevin stepped out onto the pavement, still wearing his expensive corporate suit. He left the car door wide open, freezing in the middle of the street like a statue, his brain desperately trying to process the impossible scene in front of him. The massive white fence was gone. The manicured green lawn was buried under layers of brown dust and shattered timber. A few seconds later, the passenger door opened. Chloe stepped down into the dimming light, her oversized designer sunglasses pushed up onto her head. She was clutching her incredibly expensive Hermes Birkin bag, no doubt purchased on another hidden line of credit. She took 2 steps toward the property line and stopped dead in her tracks. Even through the silent video feed, I could feel the absolute shock radiating from her. Her shoulders completely slumped, and her hands lost all their strength. That pricey handbag slipped from her fingers, tumbling straight down and landing with a thud on a pile of dusty raw dirt. She didn't even try to pick it up. She just stood there, staring blankly at the hollowed-out, roofless shell, the very home she had arrogantly planned to remodel and show off to her shallow friends next weekend. The beautiful floor-to-ceiling windows where I once stood were completely gone, leaving nothing but massive, jagged, rectangular holes in the exterior walls. The solid wood front door had been torn from its hinges, exposing the dark, ransacked belly of the house to the evening air. Kevin finally snapped out of his paralysis. Panic completely took over his movements. He burst into a frantic, uncoordinated sprint, his expensive leather dress shoes slipping and stumbling on the rough, uneven dirt track that used to be the driveway. He charged up the remaining concrete porch steps, completely ignoring the bright yellow caution tape flapping violently in the evening breeze. He burst through the empty doorway and vanished into the dark void of the ruined house. I kept my eyes locked on the screen, taking another slow sip of bourbon. The interior wasn't completely empty. Apex Pacific had left a nightly security detail on site to secure the hazardous demolition zone and prepare for the heavy clearing crews arriving first thing in the morning. I knew exactly what Kevin was encountering inside those bare walls. He was running through empty rooms, searching for a velvet sofa, a marble table, a massive flat-screen television. He found absolutely nothing but exposed wiring, torn drywall, and bare wooden studs. Less than 2 minutes after he charged inside, the entrance suddenly filled with rapid movement. Kevin stumbled backward out onto the porch, his hands raised defensively in front of his chest. Towering over him was the burly, bearded construction foreman who had been directing the demolition team all afternoon. The foreman, wearing a bright orange high-visibility vest and clutching a heavy steel clipboard, was asserting absolute dominance. Even without sound, the body language was crystal clear and completely one-sided. The foreman aggressively jabbed a thick finger straight into Kevin's chest, taking heavy, demanding steps forward and physically forcing my son backward down the porch steps. Kevin was gesturing wildly, pointing at the empty house, clearly screaming hysterically about his rights, his property, and his upcoming renovation plans. But the foreman didn't care about the tailored suit or the desperate shouting. He simply used his heavy steel clipboard to point at a massive white metal sign bolted to a thick wooden post near the street. Printed on that sign in bold, unmistakable red letters was a warning. The property was a restricted active construction site and the exclusive property of Apex Pacific Development Group. It explicitly stated that any unauthorized trespassers would be immediately arrested and prosecuted by local law enforcement. Kevin stopped gesturing completely. His arms fell limply to his sides as the reality of that massive corporate warning finally penetrated his arrogant skull. The foreman gave him one final push toward the dirt track, turned around, and walked back into the gutted house. Kevin stumbled, slowly turning his head to look over the ruined landscape. That was when he noticed his clothes, stuffed into black plastic trash bags, dumped on the lawn with a piece of paper taped to them. Kevin froze in the dirt, staring dead at the pile of black bags. Through the camera feed, I watched him with trembling hands rip the paper off the plastic. It was a formal notice of eviction and abandoned property from Apex Pacific. Before he could even finish reading the printed text, my sleek black smartphone resting on the mahogany desk began to vibrate violently. The caller ID displayed Kevin's name. I let it ring 3 times, letting his panic fully cook. On the 4th ring, I answered the call and brought it to my ear. I didn't say a word. I just listened to the chaotic, breathless gasping of absolute terror coming from the other end. "Dad, where are you?" Kevin screamed into the receiver, his voice cracking with pure hysteria. "Oh my God! Dad, you need to call the police right now. We've been robbed. The house is completely destroyed. They took the doors off. They took the windows out. They stole all our furniture. There's a crazy construction crew here claiming they own the land. Where are you? Are you safe?" He was hyperventilating, completely consumed by the collapse of his reality. I took a slow, deep breath, looking out at the Seattle skyline through the penthouse window. "I am perfectly safe, Kevin," I replied, my voice as flat and icy as winter frost. "And you haven't been robbed. A robbery means someone took something that actually belonged to you." A dead, thoroughly confused silence fell over the line, broken only by the sound of Chloe's desperate sobbing in the background. "What are you talking about?" Kevin stammered, the panic in his voice giving way to a sickening dread. "The house is gutted. Everything is gone." I took another sip from my crystal glass, savoring the absolute control I held over this moment. "You told me it was time for me to move out, Kevin. You sat at my kitchen island and told me it wasn't safe for me in the house I built with my own hands. You wanted me gone, so I left. And since my name is the only one on the deed, I decided I didn't need the house anymore either. I sold it to a corporate developer this morning for full cash. The men standing on your porch aren't robbers. They're the legal owners. And you are currently trespassing on an active, highly hazardous commercial demolition site." "You sold the house?" Kevin shrieked, his voice echoing loudly through the phone. "You can't do that. We live here. We have tenant rights. We have hundreds of thousands of dollars of luxury furniture inside. I'm calling a lawyer." I let out a low, dark chuckle. "You aren't calling any lawyers, Kevin, because you can't afford them. And you certainly don't own any furniture. Did you really think I was completely blind to your massive financial ruin? Did you think I wouldn't find out about the $3 million in SEC fines you owe for your crypto scam, or your wife's hundreds of thousands in credit card debt? The people who took your velvet sofa and marble table weren't thieves. They were asset recovery and collection agents. I personally let the collectors in the door. I gave them full permission to strip the place clean before the demolition crew arrived. They reclaimed everything you bought with money you never had. Dad, please." Kevin began to beg, his arrogance completely shattered, replaced by the pathetic whimpering of a desperate child. "You can't do this to us. I'm your son. Where are we supposed to go? We don't have a dime. We have nothing left. You have to fix this. Stop the demolition. Tell them it was a mistake." I leaned forward against the leather back of my chair. "The second you decided to treat me like a disposable roadblock, you stopped being my son," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal whisper. "Did you honestly think I was too blind to notice a new lock on my own study door? Did you think I wouldn't find that forged conservatorship application you hid in my drawer?" Absolute silence hit the other end. For a terrifying second, Kevin stopped breathing entirely. I could practically feel the pure, paralyzing terror washing over his entire body. "That's right, Kevin. I found your forged signature. I found the fake notary stamp and the fraudulent doctor's diagnosis. I read the emails between you and Summit Capital. You planned to lock me away in some sterile state institution and steal the equity in my property, just to cover up your pathetic Ponzi scheme and fund your wife's vanity. You tried to legally erase my existence, but you forgot who raised you. While you were busy packing my bags for the care center this morning, David Stanton was walking into the FBI and SEC offices in downtown Seattle. An hour ago, he personally handed over that forged document, your emails with the developers, and every hidden record of your financial crimes to the federal prosecutors. You aren't just homeless, Kevin. You're now facing multiple felony charges, including federal wire fraud, forgery, and elder abuse. The FBI is probably drafting the warrants as we speak. Dad, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Kevin burst into heavy, violent tears. "I was cornered. I didn't mean to. Please stop them. I'm begging you." I looked down at the $100 bill resting on the desk, feeling not a single shred of mercy. "I have nothing left to say to you," I told him. "Use that $100 to get a cheap motel room for the night. You'll need a place to sleep before the federal agents and local police come knocking on your door. Goodbye, Kevin." Before he could scream another desperate plea, I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red end call button. I immediately opened the settings, went into his contact profile, and blocked his number permanently. I did the exact same to Chloe's number. I flipped the phone face down onto the smooth mahogany desk. I turned my attention back to the laptop screen. Through the hidden camera, I watched my son drop to his knees in the dry dirt, burying his face deeply in his hands, while his furious wife screamed at him like a maniac in the fading Seattle twilight. Everything was finally over. Exactly 3 months have passed since that warm evening in downtown Seattle. Today, the constant drizzle of the Pacific Northwest is nothing but a distant memory, replaced by the warm, gentle breeze of the Swiss Alps. I am currently sitting on the stone terrace of a small rented chalet overlooking Lake Geneva. A glass of deep red wine rests on the wrought iron table beside me, and the aroma of roasted garlic and fresh basil drifts out from the chalet's kitchen. I take a slow, deep breath, feeling a profound peace settle into my bones. The heavy, suffocating burden of betrayal that used to anchor me to the ground is completely gone. I am finally free. But the path to this freedom required a surgical, ruthless cut. The aftermath of that Wednesday evening was swift, brutal, and completely devoid of mercy. I didn't stick around to watch the dust settle. David took over all the legal correspondence, while I quietly packed my bags and boarded a first-class flight across the Atlantic. But David made sure to brief me on every single detail of their spectacular downfall. Kevin didn't even make it through the weekend before the consequences of his arrogance completely caught up with him. That very night, just hours after I hung up the phone and blocked his number forever, he and Chloe were forced to call a rideshare to a deeply run-down motel on the outskirts of Seattle. They did, in fact, use the $100 bill Kevin had condescendingly handed me that morning to pay for a cheap, dingy room, but they didn't stay there long. Early Thursday morning, 2 marked police cruisers and a black FBI SUV pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of that motel. After reviewing the forged conservatorship documents and the detailed emails outlining his plot to seize my property, the federal prosecutors wasted no time. Kevin was arrested right there in the parking lot, wearing the same wrinkled tailored suit from the day before. He was led out of that cheap room, placed in heavy steel handcuffs, and secured in the back of a police cruiser. The charges were severe: federal wire fraud, first-degree forgery, attempted grand larceny, and elder abuse. Instead of settling his fines with the SEC, he had landed himself non-bailable federal felony charges. But the final, most devastating blow came from the very woman he had destroyed his relationship with his father to please. Chloe did not stick by her husband during his darkest hour. The exact second she realized the luxury lifestyle was permanently over, the multi-million-dollar house was reduced to rubble, and the endless stream of credit had completely dried up. Her marriage vows evaporated into thin air. Less than 3 weeks after his arrest, she filed for a bitter divorce, desperately trying to distance herself from his criminal charges and the mountain of outstanding debt. They couldn't even keep the Porsche Cayenne that had served as the ultimate symbol of their manufactured wealth. The vehicle was repossessed right from the parking lot. In the end, the only thing they had left were those black plastic trash bags dumped in the dirt. Sitting here on this beautiful terrace, watching the sun slowly sink behind the distant snow-capped mountains, I often find myself reflecting on the brutal reality of tough love. People might look at my actions and call me a cold, vengeful father. They might say that families should always forgive, no matter how deep the knife is driven into your back. But those people have never looked into their own child's eyes and seen nothing but a greedy, calculating parasite. I grieve for my son. I mourn the loss of the boy I had taught to keep a ledger. But I realized I had actually lost him decades ago. The man who forged my signature and planned to lock me away in a sterile facility just to steal the legacy of my hard work was a complete stranger. You simply cannot save someone who would happily drown you just to stand a little higher. Sometimes, the most profound thing you can do for someone with a severe moral failure is to allow them to face the absolute, unfiltered consequences of their own choices. I refused to be his final victim. I chose to survive. Now I am living the exact life my beautiful Irene and I dreamed of when we were young and struggling to make ends meet. We used to talk about traveling through Europe, tasting fine wines, and exploring ancient cities. We put those dreams on hold to build a rock-solid foundation for our family. Now I am finally honoring her memory by living every day to the fullest. I am using the wealth we built together to see the world, completely free from ungrateful children and toxic guilt. Perhaps some will say I was too harsh on my own flesh and blood. They might argue that my retaliation was too severe. But respect is a currency that must be earned, and a profound betrayal must be answered in full. I drew a hard line in the sand and enforced it in the only language they truly understood. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you have allowed them to lock you away? Or would you have dismantled the house right around them? Let me know your honest thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe in standing up for your dignity, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Thank you for watching, and always remember, never let anyone strip away your dignity.